This lecture is intended to acquaint you with the story of how, since the early part of the 20th century, a constitutional structure began to emerge in British India. And we have important landmarks in this story. It starts with the Indian Councils Act of 1909, popularly known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. This was followed by another Councils Act in 1919, the so-called Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. Then you have the Act of 1935, the famous or the infamous, the Government of India Act of 1935, which enlarged the electorate to a large extent and made provision for a certain kind of responsible government in the provinces. According to one version, the grant of independence in 1947 through an act of British Parliament had its origin in similar initiatives towards devolution of power by the British from an earlier time, prominently from the early part of the 20th century, but the roots of this policy can be traced back to similar such initiatives to create a system of elected local government as well. Now, according to one interpretation of this story, this landmarks that we have identified, the important pieces of legislation which created an electoral system in an embryonic form, which created possibilities of some amount of Indian participation in the legislative processes, allowing Indians also some amount of involvement in the executive council of the Viceroy. All these are reflections of an initiative on the part of the British towards a systematic devolution of power, initially on a smaller scale, but gradually this attempt acquired more important dimension from about 1930s onwards. It reflected at the same time an initiative towards what some historians would label as a conscious policy of decolonization emerging from the strategy of devolution of powers. People have differing views on why they did it. Some people say that initially the intention was to allow the local government institutions to derive taxes from local communities without creating much opposition, and this particular consideration was responsible for the British officials to think of a local government system in which Indians would be encouraged to participate and in the process facilitating easy collection of additional taxes for purposes of local governments, for purposes of effective municipal government, municipal administration, or district board administration. Welfare works, infrastructural developments, improvement of the roadways, etc., depended on the money that these local government institutions were able to generate from local taxation, and taxation would become more palatable if the people themselves had a hand in this. Others would argue that from about the early part of the 20th century, this was clearly moving towards a stage where the British, because of their liberal conscience, were agreeable to an extensive, more elaborate transfer of power to the hands of Indian representatives in the legislature, and subsequently allowing Indians to become involved in the act of governance.
Sir, how far was this liberal conscience effective in influencing the British policy in India?
Now, that is the point of dispute among historians. One school which argues that decolonization had started much earlier than the early part of the 20th century. There was a liberal commitment on the part of the British rulers towards the eventual self-government in India. But since they were not sure of the ability of the Indian people to manage these institutions of self-government. They waited for some time. They experimented with piecemeal reforms at the level of local governments initially, and then followed it up with more ambitious, more elaborate reforms of the kind that you see happening from around 1909 and then 1919 onwards. So that is one point of view, which sees that liberalism was an important active force in shaping British policy. You have important personalities like John Morley, for example, who was to some extent responsible for the Morley-Minto Reforms, being the Secretary of State. He was a liberal politician who had a certain commitment to the liberal ideals, who had a certain faith in Mill's vision that Indians should eventually become capable of managing institutions of self-government. And in order to achieve that target, these liberals were waiting for the Indians to acquire this skill through their apprenticeship by novitiating in the local government institutions. So that is one line of reasoning. But others would say, the nationalist school, or scholars like Bipin Chandra, for example, would argue that in India there were only few liberals. It is suggested that Ripon, who was the architect of the Local Self-Government Act in the early 1880s, was the lone liberal in India. However much the liberal politicians proclaimed the virtue of liberalism and the necessity on the part of the British to adopt a liberal posture in India, there were very few takers in the Indian administration. The Indian administration, manned by a bureaucracy, remained very conservative, and they were resistant to these ideas proclaimed from above by the liberal politicians. So this is one major caveat to the implementation or the translation of this liberal concepts as a matter of policy. Secondly, the liberal experiments, which had been valorized by the proponents of a conscious effort towards decolonization by the British, were actually responses of the British to changing political circumstances. When there was a political public emerging in the late 19th century, demanding institutions of self-government, demanding representation in British Parliament, or else creation of a parliament in India, the British were called upon by this changing situation in the empire to work out some kind of a strategy which would be able to accommodate this dissenting middle class opinion within the framework of imperial government. So, in order to ensure the collaboration of the dissenting middle class intellectuals, it was imperative on the part of the British to introduce a modicum of self-government, although limited to the local government institutions initially. And when later on pressures became more magnified with the emergence of modern nationalism, with the organization of the Congress, with the gradual expansion of the Congress and its emergence of a mass organization, the response of the government had to be more elaborate, in the sense that the kind of strategy they had successfully deployed in the late 19th century, allowing limited participation of Indians in the legislature, did not suffice in the altered circumstances of the early 20th century, when pressures were such that it required more elaborate concessions to be able to arrive at a point of compromise with the Indians. So, Bipin Chandra's argument is that one has to look at all these changes in terms of Indian pressure to which the British had to respond by way of a strategy of compromise, the upshot of which was the creation of a constitutional structure in the empire.
Sir, in what sense was this legislation important in the long-term evolution of the constitutional framework of British India?
Yeah, part of the answer I have given already, that this was one of the earliest initiatives on the part of the British to introduce a modicum of self-government in India. As you know, these Indian intellectuals, who had by then become addicted to the nationalist ideals, began to look upon the British state as an essentially despotic state, a retrograde system, a system which was un-British in character. So, the only way to silence such criticism was to create some opportunities for Indians to participate in decision making, if not at the higher level, but at the lower levels of administration. So Local Self-Government Act certainly was an important landmark in the history of the evolution of constitutional structure in British India. It allowed some amount of non-official Indian representation in the district boards and municipalities. It certainly was carrying the imprint of a liberal conscience. The Viceroy, the Lord Ripon, who was the architect of this scheme, but many people felt that in India in the 1880s, Ripon was the only liberal. You have the failure of the Ilbert Bill experiment to demonstrate how stubbornly the Indian bureaucracy resisted many of these liberalizing measures, including the Local Self-Government Act. Local Self-Government Act, as the resolution of the Local Self-Government Act goes, was intended as an institution of political education for Indians in order to accommodate the opinions of the middle classes, which Ripon thought was bad policy for the British to ignore. So the objective was clear enough, that you have in the meanwhile seen the emergence of a modern political public capable of responding to British ideas and Western ideas effectively, and Ripon thought that it was bad policy for them to ignore the modern political public in statecraft, in the management of the empire. But if you look at the manner in which this act could be implemented, you see the stubborn resistance by the provincial officials, the governors particularly, who did not actually agree with Ripon's idea that in all these district board and municipalities, the control over the institutions must rest with Indians. The governors insisted on the control over these institutions by the district officers. So one of the objectives of Ripon, which was to create a local self-governing institution in which Indians would receive political education, allowing them certain amount of control over these bodies, was never realized. But there was, however, an important dimension which is often missed, which is that when the councils were reformed in the Act of 1891, which was a major improvement on the Councils Act of 1861, which provided for the Legislative Council and the Executive Council at the imperial center and the provinces, these institutions of local government actually emerged as the electoral college for election to these superior legislative councils, in which, by the provision of the Councils Act of 1891-92, non-official Indian representation was assured. But once again, the non-official Indians were never allowed a majority. There was strict official control over these institutions. Even if the Congress had by then begun to demand forcefully introduction of parliamentary government in India, there was no positive response, except for the reform of 1892, by which some opportunities were created for non-official representation in the legislatures, but under a system governed by official majority in the first place. And then people were not directly elected by the constituencies to the legislatures. It's a very interesting system, whereby different interests in the society, these were universities, chambers of commerce, landowners, Europeans, different sections in the society, in their independent electoral college, chose people who could be considered by the Viceroy and the Governor General for nominations to the legislatures. It was not as if that the electoral college would elect some people directly to the legislatures as their representatives. They could suggest nominations which the Viceroy would consider, considering all other factors about these individuals, and would eventually accept these nominations. The Viceroy, however, also had the right to reject these nominations. It was a halfway house between a system based on elective representation and a system that had been in practice by the Act of 1861, based essentially on nomination. The Act of 1909, known popularly as the Morley-Minto Reforms, was intended as an improvement on this system.
Excuse me, sir, what were the main provisions of this Morley-Minto Reforms?
Now, you have a number of provisions of this Act. It's no point in going into the details of what clauses were inserted into the Council's Act of 1909 to bring about the necessary improvement on the legislation of 1892. But what requires to be remembered, or what requires to be borne in mind in this context, concerns once again the manner of representation. This was not a representation of number as we see in a modern democratic system. It was a representation of interests. And with this strategy of making provisions or creating opportunities for representation of interest in the legislatures, the British were actually playing with divisive interest in Indian society. You have the Muslims who were given a separate representation in the sense of choosing people from their own electorate, defined in terms of religion, in terms of a religious community that they were. This was basically a continuation of the practice of the earlier times, where constituencies which suggested nomination to the legislatures were defined in terms of certain sectional interest in the land. They were landowners. Landowners were preferred by the British fairly consistently. Whenever it came to the question of nominating somebody to either the Executive Council or to the legislature, the British relied on the loyal landowners. But landowners were not the only constituent category for purposes of representation. There are other categories also. You have Europeans, for example, you have chambers of commerce, you have other constituencies which I have mentioned, including Muslims. So one important development in the Morley-Minto reforms was the introduction of a clearly defined principle of separate electorate for the Muslims. So this brings us to the political story behind the constitutional change, the story of political manipulations, political agitation, and the kind of backstage manipulation that had been going on in the making of the Morley-Minto reforms. Morley, true to his liberal conscience, made a declaration in 1906 in the budget speech, partly in response to Gokhale's constant pleading in London that there was an urgency on the part of the British to declare their intent to introduce some principles of self-government in the legislative representation. That was the Congress demand for a long time. And the Congress moderate leadership, the liberal leadership who had hitherto espoused the liberal principles of English liberal principles, felt that the British government had an obligation to respond to these demands in order to allow them to survive in the face of the great onslaught of militant nationalism emerging in Indian politics from the 1890s onwards. So Gokhale had been able to persuade Morley to make an announcement, but Morley didn't actually anticipate that in India his ideas were not expected to cut any ice, thanks to the kind of conservatism that had influenced always the British bureaucracy. Minto, the viceroy representing the British Indian bureaucracy, had a dissenting voice, who was not willing to allow any great measure of Indian involvement, either in no way in the Executive Council. He would allow representation in the legislature, but retaining an element of official control. But at the same time, when he found an opportunity in the Muslim demand for some kind of protection in a democratic system, in an emerging representative system from the effect of official majority, he found an opportunity to play with this social division. So separate electorate became an important feature by way of Minto actually encouraging Muslim leaders to come up with their demands for separate electorate. So this is for this reason that Morley-Minto reforms had remained as one of the early steps by the British to use this constitutional mechanism, this strategy of constitutional devolution of power, as an attempt to sow seeds of permanent political discord in India. The situation would of course change 10 years later. The Morley-Minto reforms actually were able to provide only a kind of temporary resolution to these problems that we are talking about. problems of representation, problems of middle class political dissent, the way Congress was demanding rights of representation. Morley-Minto Reforms was not able to resolve the Indian constitutional problem, partly because of the manner in which they dealt with the issue of representation, the manner in which ultimately official control was retained despite some opportunities for non-official Indian representation in the legislatures, either in the imperial level or in the provincial level, the manner in which the nomination in the Executive Council remained the exclusive preserve of the Viceroy, who invariably would choose loyalist members from the landowning communities. In addition, the separate electorate would certainly emerge as a source of long-term discord in Indian politics. The Congress, of course, was dissatisfied. And even though the war situation made a diversion, there was a relapse of militant nationalism, there was a move away towards revolutionary violence. So there were divisions in the Congress which weakened the organization considerably. But by 1915, 1916, just before the end of the war, the Congress division that had taken place earlier in Surat came to be resolved somewhat with the re-entry of Tilak and his followers into the Congress. There was an agreement with the Muslim League in 1916 in the Lucknow session known as the Lucknow Pact, and together the League and the Congress agreed to start a renewed agitation for wider representation, a share of power in the government, representation not merely in the legislatures where representation required to be more broad-based, more democratic, more direct, but also some space, some opportunities for representation, Indian participation in the Executive Council as well. So there was a need once again, from after the end of the war, to introduce a fresh dose of constitutional reforms which came with the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms.
Sir, what objectives did this Montagu-Chelmsford reform wish to achieve?
Basically, to enlarge the scope of representation in the legislature, which followed roughly the old principle. Blocks were carved, which then were allowed their representation. The electorate, of course, was somewhat enlarged. The very high property qualification that existed in 1909 for purposes of election or purpose of representation were somewhat relaxed. But the most important innovation was diarchy in the provinces. This has something to do with the way the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms actually created a system by which certain departments were left with the Indian ministers, nominated once again, but nominated from amongst members of the Legislative Council. The transferred subjects, as they were called, included relatively unimportant, politically unimportant departments like education or culture or development and all that. Home department, of course, never was left in the list of transferred subjects. These were reserved subjects, exclusively under the control of the Viceroy, operating through the Anglo-Indian bureaucracy, dominated by the British ICS officials. So the limitation, of course, existed in the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms or the reforms of 1919, even though the size of the electorate was substantially enlarged to create a more broad-based electoral college, even though some amount of direct representation of the legislature in the government level was also assured through this system of diarchy. But the greater significance of Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, as some historians actually read it, lies in the way the government or the imperial state was trying desperately to cling to an empire when the foundations of the empire had become weakened by Indian agitation, when the credibility of the empire had declined, even among those Indian politicians who did not wish to start a rebellion against the imperial state. So it is in this context that you come across this very spirited declaration by Edwin Montagu, once again a liberal politician, that immediately the Indian constitutional problem required a positive intervention. Even though Chelmsford was agreeable, but together they ultimately worked out a policy which actually fell far short of the expectations of the Indian political leadership, the Congress. Nobody was happy. The diarchy created a sense among the Indian politicians about how little they had ultimately come to enjoy by way of power. They realized that the main sources of power remained in the hands of the British bureaucracy. But then what did it wish to achieve? It wished to achieve a system whereby the British thought they would be able to persuade at least certain section of the Indian political elite to remain or to function within the imperial system. And they were eminently successful. But as you know, that if just after the non-cooperation movement, there was a debate in the Congress regarding council entry, they did succeed in persuading sections of the Indian politicians to operate within the imperial system by becoming members of the council, by becoming involved in ministry making to some extent, by tasting power, in other words. So David Page has a very interesting argument in a book called Prelude to Partition, which is concerned with Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, in which he argues that far from an attempt to devolve powers, far from an attempt to leave India, eventually, this was clear indication of the British trying to cling to the empire by resorting to the strategy of constitutional devolution. So that is where the relevance of the nationalist argument comes up. But Page also argues that in the process they created an enlarged electorate. And in order to cultivate support of this enlarged electorate, the Indian politicians had to redefine their political priorities by adopting increasingly a strategy of mass mobilization. Just because the government had, through its impulse, created a constitutional system with an enlarged electorate, the Indian politicians were required by these changes to shake off their earlier inertia about mass mobilization and look forward to a strategy of effective mass mobilization. This, I think, is not really acceptable. Mobilization of the masses, as it took place from 1920s onwards, took place for different reasons. It created a greater pressure on the government, and eventually the system that was created by the Montagu-Chelmsford Reform, the system based on diarchy, had to be changed in the 1930s with the Act of 1935. This will take up on a later occasion.